The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
With your long-forgotten name, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
In the words of the unspeakable language, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
By the spilt blood of the wicked, who walk upon this world, sprouting the words of false idols, we call upon you.
We call upon you.
On the land of the dead harvest, that which brings the earth itself into your service, Yamal, we call upon you.
We call upon you. We call upon you. We call upon you.
Yamal calls upon you.
The Sprouting, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast by Blighthouse Studio. Find us on your podcatcher of choice.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today is the finale of the series about Mary, Queen of Scots. There's something about Mary, Queen of Scots. We're going to be looking at the four Marys, who were her companions, who have been, we mentioned them on and off throughout the whole series, but I never really got into depth about who they were, how you can tell them apart, what their connection is to the four ladies in waiting on the TV show Reign. And we're going to get into that today, but first I have some announcements to give you. First of all, there's some new merch in the merch store inspired by this season. So both of these designs were done by Karen Moynihan, who has designed merch for us before. She did the Reformation, Renaissance, Girl Squad, and the Mary Shelley, Goth Queen, Mom Friend designs. And she did an amazing job with these new merch ideas. So the first one is in honor of the De Guise family, who we mentioned a lot throughout the whole thing. They were just really fucking things up for Mary the whole time. Oh, also to new listeners, hi. I'm going to swear in this podcast, and I also say like a normal amount. And if you can't deal with that, there's lots of other podcasts you can listen to. Anyway, so the first design just says, "Don't stop De Guise," and it looks kind of like a rock band logo from the 80s, and I love it. And the other one is inspired by a thing that friend of the podcast and frequent co-host Lana Wood Johnson said in one of the final Mary, Queen of Scots episodes, which is, Lana said that she's at least as good a leader as William Cecil. And that really resonated with a lot of listeners. And so this other design, it's sort of like a motivational poster, like from the 80s or 90s. It says, "Remember, you are at least as good a leader as William Cecil." And you can get that on. You can get the "Don't Stop De Guise" on t-shirts, on stickers. You can get the William Cecil one on a poster, on a mug, various different things. And so the merch is for sale in 2 different places. So if you go to vulgarhistory.com/store, that takes you to our TeePublic store, where that's best for people in the US, just in terms of the shipping costs and stuff. And then if you go to vulgarhistory.redbubble.com, that takes you to our Redbubble store where the shipping is a bit better if you're living anywhere other than the United States, basically. And also just want to let you know, stay tuned to the end of today's episode for an update about what is coming next for Vulgar History since we're at the end of the Mary Queen of Scots season. Exciting stuff is coming up next is what I want to say. I also wanted to share a book recommendation. So I've been doing I've had a lot of author interviews lately on the show, and we're going to continue doing those. There's not always space in the schedule to interview all the authors whose books I think would be of interest to you. So just when there's one where I'm not able to do an interview, I want to let you know about it. So especially because I've been trying to get more of a diversity of people who we talk about on the show, other than like white Christian European royal women. I want to get into different people of different ethnicities, different religions from all different parts of the world. And one of those groups of people that I'm trying to find more people to talk about are Jewish women. And so this book I thought would be a good one to talk about. So it's a new book coming out, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor by Rachel Stier. So the feminist writer and activist Betty Friedan, born 1921, died in 2006, was the path-breaking author of The Feminine Mystique. She was powerful and polarizing. In this biography, the first in more than 20 years, Rachel Stier draws on Friedan's papers and on interviews with family, colleagues, and friends to create a nuanced portrait. Friedan, born Betty Naomi Goldstein, chafed at society's restrictions from a young age. As a journalist, she covered racism, sexism, labor, class inequality, and anti-Semitism. As a wife and mother, she struggled to balance her work and homemaking. Her malaise as a housewife and her research into the feelings of other women resulted in The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, which made her a celebrity. Using her influence, Friedan co-founded the National Organization for Women, the National Women's Political Caucus, and the National Association to Repeal Abortion Laws. She fought for the Equal Rights Amendment, universal childcare, and workplace protections for mothers, but she disagreed with the women's liberation movement over, quote, sexual politics. Her volatility and public conflicts fractured key relationships. So in this biography, the author, Stier, considers how Friedan's Judaism was essential to her feminism, presenting a new Friedan for a new era. So again, that book is called Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor by Rachel Stier, and has just been published, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes so you can easily find a way to learn more about the book and buy a copy. And so I do also want to give you the references for today's episode, which are... So there's a biography of Mary Queen of Scots by Antonia Fraser. For a lot of the Mary Queen of Scots episodes, I was using the biography by John Guy, just that was the one I picked up first, and that's the one I was using. But I found that the biography by Antonia Fraser, which was the first major Mary Queen of Scots biography published like in the 20th century, and it's the one that Lana Wood Johnson especially loves. So I was happy to find so much information in Antonia's book about the four Marys. So I used that as a big reference for this episode. Also, the book Daughters of the North by Jennifer Morag Henderson, who we had on the podcast earlier, talking about Jean Gordon. So you'll see why that book has a lot of information about specifically one of these four Marys. I also got information from Claire Hunter's book Embroidering Her Truth, which talks about Mary Queen of Scots and her embroidery projects. Like, again, you'll see how that interacts with this story. I also got information from Wikipedia, which had just times and dates and facts. And if you've listened to this podcast before, you know that I have no problem with using information from Wikipedia. Often it's a quick way to find some straightforward information, and that can help lead you to other sources to dive deeper into various things. And then another book I used is Mary Queen of Scots Secretary William Maitland, politician, reformer, and I'm sorry, the title is really small on my Kindle, and conspirator is the final word. Anyway, so that's by Robert Stidell, and you'll learn why I was reading about him. He's the one who, in the Mary Queen of Scots episodes, we called Scottish Machiavelli, and he has to do with this story as well. So I will also say, if you're new to this podcast, welcome. Glad to have you here. And just know that I've done a whole lot of episodes about Mary Queen of Scots leading up to this point, and there's a lot of nicknames I'm using for people. So when you're listening to this, you're like, what's she talking about? What does Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart have to do with Mary Queen of Scots? Like, just go with it. And if you want to learn how and why all these people got these nicknames, you can listen back to the Mary Queen of Scots season. So the four Marys, I love them as, like, I've just loved the concept of them this whole time. You know, when she arrived, wherever she went, when she arrived in Scotland, for instance, Mary arrived with the Marys, and they're all dressed in like black and white, and they just having them as her entourage. Like you just picture them strutting down the streets of anywhere they went, just kind of like the slow motion walking montage at the beginning of a Law and Order episode, or that part in Mean Girls where they're walking slowly down the hallway. Like they're a girl gang and they're just like coordinated with each other within an inch of their lives. Like I just love the energy of this, and I love that Mary had these besties with her. So Mary Queen of Scots was born in Scotland, and then in 1548, when she's around 5 years old, she was sent to France for her own protection and safety. At that time, she was escorted by her 4 ladies in waiting, which is a cute thing to call a bunch of little girls. They were all coincidentally named Mary. Now, I think in that TV show, The Serpent Queen, I think they suggest that Mary Queen of Scots forced them all to change their name to Mary, which is maybe something that other people have said in other places, but is not true. Like, as we've learned from this podcast season, there was like 6 names that anyone ever had in Scotland at this time, and Mary was one of those names. It's not a coincidence. They are all called Mary. Like when I was going to school, and I am an elder millennial, like every girl was called Sarah or Megan, and all the boys were called Chris. Like names become popular and people all have the same name, and that's there's nothing nefarious about that necessarily. So they're all coincidentally named Mary. Some of them were born before her, so it's not like they're all named after her. It does seem likely that Mary, Queen of Scots' mother, Marie de Guise, personally chose these young girls to be companions to the little girl queen. So these 4 all had Scottish fathers, and 2 of them had French mothers. So they could be relied upon to be loyal not only to their Scottish queen, but also to the French queen mother, Marie de Guise. So they are known to history as the 4 Marys, and their names are Mary Seton, Mary Fleming, Mary Beaton, and Mary Livingston. We're talking about a lot of people called Mary today, so I'm going to try to always use their full name, sometimes just their last name. When I'm talking about the Queen, I'll say Mary Queen of Scots, probably, just so you know, or maybe I'll say the Queen. So of these, they're all of noble and high birth. All 4 came from notably honorable houses. Mary Fleming was also a first cousin to Mary Queen of Scots because her grandfather, they had the same grandfather, King James V. So Mary Fleming's mother was the illegitimate half-sister. Anyway, they were cousins. Like, don't worry about it. There's a lot of people called James. I might have just misinterpreted the family tree, but they were first cousins. They had the same grandfather. But Mary Fleming's was in an illegitimate way, and Mary Queen of Scots was in a legitimate way. So they were called the Marys, and it's spelled often as Maries, so like the Maries, because they were 4 people called Marys, and they were always in a group. But also in Scots, at least at that time, and maybe now also, people who speak Scots, let me know. The word Marie was used to describe, like it was a word that just meant maids in honor attendant on the queen. So they were called Mary, but also their job was the Marys. So in 1548, the 4 Marys joined their queen. And again, these are like girls who were like basically all 5 years old, some a bit younger, some a bit older, at Inchmahome Priory. So that is in Scotland, I think, in preparation for their journey to France. If you go to Inchmahome Priory, I think there's plaques and things saying that they were there, these little girls. The journey from France to Scotland was a rough sea voyage. I talked about that in one of the first Mary Queen of Scots episodes. It was recorded during this journey. All of the ladies, which again, they're called the ladies, they're like 5-year-old girls. They all came down with seasickness. And this is when they kind of entered the public sphere. Like their public lives began. Like they were people that, I don't know, today it's like the paparazzi would follow them. Like they were just like child stars of their era. So their public lives began simultaneously when they were sailing on that galley to France in 1548. But as we're going to talk about, they were a unit until like life reasons separated them. Like they all ended their lives differently in different interesting ways, but they sort of emerged on the public sphere simultaneously, like a new generation of the Mickey Mouse Club or whatever. So upon their arrival in France, it was made clear that their stations were different. So Mary was sent to join the royal children, so her future husband and in-laws, Princess Elizabeth, the whole gang, while the ladies, the girls, these little girls, were separated from her. So the 4 Marys were initially sent away to be educated by Dominican nuns. And so that's where they spent most of this time, while Mary, like they still got to visit with her, I think, but Mary Queen of Scots was living like doing queen shit, and they were off kind of just being there if needed. But they learned French, they learned calligraphy, like they had schooling and training and stuff while they were in France. So the time in France was not as long as anyone expected. So Mary Queen of Scots, she married Francis Francis's dad died, and then Mary Queen of Scots ruled as Queen of France until Francis himself died. So this is 1560. So they're all around 18 years old now. And at this time, also Marie de Guise also had died. So with no French husband, with her mother dead, Mary Queen of Scots was now like in a place where the best bet for her, like the best and kind of only option, was to return to Scotland as queen. So the four Maries' French education was completed, and they were sent to accompany their mistress back to Scotland, as they had accompanied her to France so many years ago. And Scotland would be the place where the four Marys would seek and find their own husbands in most cases, as their now widowed queen would seek out a new husband for herself. And we're going to go Mary by Mary instead of kind of what happened simultaneously with each other, just so we can really focus on who each of these four Marys is. And that was one of my first challenges when I was researching this, was just to try to, from my own mind, figure out kind of how can I think about them? What are the differences between them? And so part of this is reading about them, and I would think, okay, which of the four ladies in waiting on Reign does each of these match up with? And so on Reign, they're not called Mary, I think for understandable reasons. It's just like, why would you name 5 main characters all the same thing on a TV show? Of course, they gave them different names, but each of the ladies in waiting on Reign, which again, if you're new to this podcast, is my favorite TV show of all time, a perfect show, 10 out of 10, no notes. So they all were given different names. But so I was trying to figure out for myself, which of these Marys, like in real life, inspired which of the ladies in waiting on Reign. And then I also started thinking about, kind of the iconicness of having a group of 4 female friends. And there's so many versions of that. Like there's the 4 March sisters and Little Women. There's the 4 Golden Girls on the Golden Girls. Blackpink is the K-pop group. There's 4 members of that. The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, there's 4 of them. And then also, if you combine 2 of the sisters in Pride and Prejudice, there's basically 4. If you just kind of treat Lydia and Kitty as all the same person. So they all match up. And so just trying to think of them in the term of all those things helped me keep them straight. And I don't know which of those references, which of you were going to vibe with. So I'll just give you them all so you can kind of imagine. So the first person we're talking about is Mary Livingston. So the character on Reign who she inspired, and I was kind of proud of myself because I would guess and then I would look in the Reign wiki and I'm like, haha, I was right. So the one who she inspired was Kenna on Reign, who, if you remember, she was she's kind of the most sexy of all of them on Reign. She was sort of also she could be impetuous. She just had a real sort of vitality about her and a real just flirtatiousness. And so I was thinking Mary Livingston, if she was one of the sisters in Pride and Prejudice, she would be Lydia mixed with Kitty, because Kitty is kind of an appendage of Lydia. If she's in Little Women, Mary Livingston would be Amy. If Mary Livingston was in Golden Girls, she would be Blanche. And if she was in Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, I would say Bridget, because she was really full of life and energy and real vivacity. And that's part of why I also think if she was in Blackpink, she would be Lisa. She's got that same sort of energy about her. And also, Lisa is the main dancer in Blackpink. And Mary Livingston, we don't know a lot about her, but we do know that she was really into dancing. So that's who we're looking at. Kenna, Lisa, Lydia, Kitty, Amy, Blanche, Bridget from the Traveling Pants. That's Mary Livingston. So Mary Livingston was born around 1541, the daughter of Alexander Livingston, the 5th Lord Livingston, and his second wife, Agnes Douglas, a daughter of John Douglas, the 2nd Earl of Morton. So you're all saying it, a Douglas. So she's got these Douglas connections, although she was always loyal to Mary herself, despite having some Douglas in her. We know that the Douglases were often, except for with a few exceptions, pretty shitty to Mary overall. But you know what? Some of the Douglases were good. # not all Douglases. Young Willie was a Douglas. Anyway, Mary Livingston. So her father, Alexander, was also Mary Queen of Scots' guardian. Her younger sister, Magdalene Livingston, was a maid of honor to Mary Queen of Scots. And so I don't know the specific numbers, but I do know that Mary Queen of Scots, like if there's her at the middle of this circle, the outer layer, like her confidants were the Marys, the 4 of them. And then there's another outer circle, like they were the ladies in waiting. But the outer circle is the maid of honor, and there's more of them, and it's like a less status position. But several of the maid of honors seem to have been the sisters of the Marys. So it's not just Mary and these 4 people. It's Mary and this like group of people who are all connected through family ties and intermarriage and things. So Mary Livingston arrived with the other Marys in Scotland, fabulous in black and white outfits, just like striking a pose in Scotland. And all the men in Scotland who, as far as I can tell, were all approximately 40 years old. We're all just like, what is this? Who are these cool young teens? Because they were all 18 at the time-ish. So Mary Livingston and the others, they arrived bringing youthful fun, party atmosphere. Like Scotland, if you will recall, had been in the midst of this reformation for quite a while. John Knox screaming at everybody, calling everybody whores. There had been, the asshole lords have been turning against Marie of Guise. Like, it's just, everyone's been at war constantly. Like, all these men, they're all called James, they're signing paperwork. It's just like, they've all been through a lot of shit. And then the Marys arrive, and it's just like, oh my gosh, like, they're glamorous, they're beautiful. Look at these outfits. Like, look at this fun energy. If we're talking about, like, what Reign got historically accurate, like, the way that Reign dealt with Mary going to Scotland, she only had one lady in waiting with her at that point on the show. But if you think about the very first season 1, episode 1 of Reign, where it shows them arriving in France, which is, they kind of just changed facts around a little bit to have it happen that way. Anyway, whatever, Reign, no problems, 10 out of 10, no notes. They come on the scene, the Marys, and there's a scene where they're all getting ready for this party and they're doing each other's hair and makeup, and then they go to the party and they're dancing, and everyone is just like, who are these people? Like, what is this fun energy these people are bringing to this, like, really, straight-laced royal court? And that's the vibe. Like, they just brought fun to a place that had been just in war constantly this whole time. So John Knox hated her. He hated all of them. He hated Mary Queen of Scots. He hated anyone called Mary, apparently. He focused his attention on the 4 Marys because he was hopeful that if there's scandal around them, he could use that to badmouth Mary Queen of Scots by being like, look at these shitty people she hangs out with. So, for instance, early on in Mary's time in Scotland, a French woman who served Mary, so not one of the Marys, but like a more outer circle person, became pregnant by the Queen's apothecary, and the two of them, I'm not sure exactly if they conspired to have an abortion or if like the baby was born and then they killed the baby. I'm getting this information via John Knox, who's not a reliable source of information. But we do know something happened with this French woman and with the apothecary. We know pregnancy was involved. And both the men and the woman were hanged for this that they had done. And in fact, so John Knox was just like, look at these slutty whores who are around Mary Queen of Scots. They're all like this. They're all just like getting pregnant out of wedlock, blah, blah, blah. This means that she's a shitty person. But he did not write in his record like what is true, which is that Mary Queen of Scots herself insisted on this death sentence being carried out. She was not here for like premarital sex, like abortion, like that was not her vibe. She was overseeing a party atmosphere, but she was also like incredibly Catholic and following those rules. But John Knox was just like, okay, but I need to like somehow make the Marys seem like whores. And so when Mary Livingston, who was the first of the Marys to get married, John Knox was like, I think they're getting married because she also is pregnant outside of wedlock. And that's why this wedding preparation is being rushed and like she's a whore, etc. But the thing is, like, we know that Mary Livingston's marriage was planned for about 2 months, which seems like not a lot of time maybe now, considering how long people plan weddings. But for then, that was like de rigueur. That was normal. That was fine. Like her wedding, if anything, it was delayed. So John Knox referred to Mary Livingston as lusty. I don't know if other people did, but I feel like the Reign writers were like, great. Mary Livingston is lusty. Let's make Kenna in the first episode, like masturbate in a hallway and get caught by the king and become his mistress. Like they took the word and they ran with it. But the lustiness, I think that John Knox even was referring to her is just how much fun she had dancing. I mentioned this to a friend of the podcast, Lena Johnson, who was like, oh, she probably just had boobs. Like, that's probably just like, if you have big boobs and you like dancing, someone like John Knox is just going to be like, oh, look at that slut. Like, whatever. She liked dancing. Her husband, or her fiance turned husband, was called John Sempill. John Knox called him the dancer. And I'm going to say, like, a couple that John Knox calls the dancer and lusty are just like, I'm here for it. Like, what a cool couple. I like that. Anyway, she liked to dance, and John Knox didn't like that. But she was reliable to Mary Queen of Scots. She was given special charge of the Queen's jewels. Like, all the Marys were entirely loyal to Mary, who also liked dancing, for the record. So as we heard in the Mary episode, she was always really supportive when people who worked for her were getting married. So she paid for the wedding gown and the bridal bouquet, and she gave Mary Livingston a dowry of £500 a year in land. John Knox, because he's got to be himself, he disapproved of the grants of lands because it included the barony of Auchtermuchty. Scots people, did I say that right? I hope I did. He just thought that Auchtermuchty, that barony should be given to someone else and not to her. But fuck you, John Knox. Guess what? You're not the king. She's the queen and she can do what she wants. And so actually, so Mary Livingston's first child was born a year after the wedding. This was not a shotgun wedding. This was, if anything, it was delayed. Initially they were going to get married in the autumn of 1564 and then was delayed until 1565. So John Knox, full of shit, but what else is new? So who's this husband? So his name was John Sempill of Beltrees. His father was born in England, so he had some connections to England, and he was in his 40s because, as it seems to me, based on the men I read about in terms of this episode, every man in Scotland was in his 40s when the Marys arrived. So it's just kind of if they're going to get married, that is the age of the husband they're going to get. So she's in her early 20s, he was in his 40s. Let's go. So the marriage was celebrated at court during the Shrovetide feast on March 5th, which is called Festerin's Eve in Scotland. And there was a masque for which a painter was paid £12 for making props. The English diplomat Thomas Randolph, remember that name? Actually, remember this name. I'm going to call him Randy Randolph because you'll see why. Anyway, so Randy Randolph called this the great marriage of this happy Englishman that shall marry Lusty Livingston. So did John Knox get everyone calling her Lusty Livingston? I hope she owned that. I hope she was yeah, hell yeah, I am Lusty Livingston. Lust for life. So Randy had heard of a plan to invite the Earl of Bedford, who was governor of Berwick-upon-Tweed, to the wedding because Sempill's mother was also English. Earl of Bedford had previously not visited Edinburgh. So part of this is you know how in all the stories with Queen Elizabeth, it's people needed to ask her permission to get married and nobody did, and she was always mad. So Mary Queen of Scots both A, liked matchmaking, and B, she knew that the marriages of the Marys, who were these really notable Scottish noblewomen, she wanted them to marry somebody that would be advantageous to her and to her politically and to her royal court. So I think clearly she wanted this connection to England by permitting this marriage to Sempill the dancer. So as the first of the Marys to marry, Lusty Livingston's wedding attracted a great deal of attention because the Marys were just the celebrities of the time. So French and English ambassadors attended the event and they wrote a lot of details about the event because again, Scotland was just these 40-year-old men who had been signing paperwork and screaming at each other for 20 years. And now it's just a fun wedding, something nice and youthful and enjoyable. In a report, so the French ambassador wrote a letter to Catherine de Medici reporting on this event. He wrote that Queen Mary has begun to marry off her Marys and says she wished herself were one of the band. She wanted to get married as well. And then, she did. So things we talked about in excruciating detail in previous episodes. So Mary befriended Rizzio. Rizzio was murdered. Mary escaped. Then she came back in triumph. Her husband Darnley his house was exploded. He was strangled. Tits out mermaid posters. She was captured by Bothwell, who forced him to marry her. And so the next mention of Mary Livingston after the wedding is after all that stuff happened with Mary. So eventually Mary, she's taken in by the asshole lords, then call themselves the Confederate lords, post Bothwell marriage. So there was that standoff. Bothwell ran away to Denmark and Mary was taken prisoner. She was on the horse, being led by the banner with her screaming baby picture on it, being avenge me, oh Lord. So at that point, Mary was brought to Holyrood, the castle. And there, she's reunited with Mary Livingston, as well as one of the other Marys, Mary Seton. Supper was prepared for her. And I just feel everything Mary went through, everything Mary Livingston had watched Mary go through, they're just oh my God, my girls. Just to be I don't know. I just think of in RuPaul's Drag Race when Ru is bring me my girls. Mary's just with her girls and thank God. So they got to hang out for a bit, but then Mary Queen of Scots was taken away, not allowed to bring the Marys with her. Various things happened. Mary Queen of Scots was in Lochleven, then she wound up in England. And after she went to England, Mary Livingston retained some of the jewels, some of Mary, the Queen's jewels. She sent them to, I don't know, she inherited them, so she had them sent to her where she was staying at Bolton Castle. Her husband, John Sempill the dancer, was charged at this point. The regent was Lennox, who was Darnley's dad. So you remember the whole thing, like Mary was taken to jail and it was just a free for all. Everyone just started stealing all of her jewels. So Lennox was like, return these jewels and furs. John Sempill, the dancer, to his credit, refused. He was imprisoned in Blackness Castle. Like years later, more people were questioned about any jewels still in her keeping. I don't know if her husband was eventually released. Didn't read that in any of my books. But eventually, I assume he was. People are just always in and out of jail at this point. Mary Livingston outlived her husband. As a widow, in January 1582, she brought legal action against her father-in-law over the possession of some lands. After last time's Bess of Hardwick episode, I'm just always here for a woman taking a man to court. Mary Livingston, though she died that same year, she was aged around 39. And this was about 5 years before the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. And she had some children who included Sir James Sempill, who became a Scottish ambassador to England from 1591 to 1600. So the next Mary we're talking about is Mary Fleming. And this one is not as hard to deduce which of the ladies in waiting in Reign was inspired by her because her last name is Fleming. And one of the ladies in waiting on Reign is called Lola Fleming. So the thing with Mary Fleming is that she was the most beautiful of the Marys. Like the Marys were uniformly beautiful. I think it's the sort of thing, especially as a group, they were beautiful. But among them, everyone kind of agreed Mary Fleming was the most beautiful. So in that sense, if we're looking at like sort of like this classically, like in a group of four, the one who provides the visual. Now I want to say, all the members of Blackpink are gorgeous, obviously, but officially, Jisoo's role is visual. So she's there. Like, Mary Fleming is providing the visual. Mary Livingston is the dancer. But they're both gorgeous. If we're looking at, on Golden Girls, I think she's like Rose, who, again, I don't think any of the Golden Girls are prettier or less pretty than the others, but just kind of like the gentle, soft, nice one, which is why I would ascribe her to Jane Bennett in Pride and Prejudice and Meg March in Little Women. So Mary Fleming is the pretty one. And Sister of the Traveling Pants, that would be Lena, the one played by Alexis Bledel in the movies. So Mary Fleming was also, she's not just beautiful, or maybe this is why she was beautiful. She was a cousin of Mary Queen of Scots, as I mentioned before. So she has this royal blood in her. So she was the youngest child of Malcolm Fleming, the third Lord Fleming, and Lady Janet Stewart. So her mother, Janet, was an illegitimate daughter of James IV of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots' grandfather, Margaret Tudor's husband. So Janet was also named governess to baby Mary. Mary Fleming was born the same year as Mary Queen of Scots, and Janet Fleming was chosen to be, well, she was the governess, and then Mary Fleming became one of the baby queen's baby companions because they were also cousins. Janet Fleming, who we talked about in one of the Mary Queen of Scots episodes, yes, she's the one who went over and became mistress to the King of France and had an illegitimate child with him and then was kicked out of French court. That was her. I feel like they took some of her story for Kenna on Reign, but so Antonia Fraser in her biography, she suggests that Mary Fleming was probably Mary Queen of Scots' closest friend because they were cousins. They were all like very well off, powerful young women of the era, but Mary Fleming being like part royal, I think maybe she could get Mary in a way that the other ones couldn't. So the same year that Mary Fleming was born, her father was taken prisoner by the English at the Battle of Solway Moss. Like all four of the Marys had like some real stressful situations by the time they were 5. Like all of their families, like because they were in Scotland where it was just like constant war. So like all of the men were fighting on one side or the other of the war and often taken prisoner and stuff. Anyway, so 1548, Mary Fleming, 5 years old. Mary Queen of Scots, 5 years old. Janet, adult-aged, super sexy. And they went over to the court of King Henry II of France. So Mary Queen of Scots, again, separated from the Marys. I will note that Mary Fleming's father had died the previous years when she was 4. So her father was taken prisoner the year she was born, and then he died when she was 4 at the Battle of Pinkie. Her mother had this affair with the French king, the product of which was a son, Henri d'Angoulême, who was born around 1551, and then her mother was kicked out. So that's a lot for Mary Fleming to go through, like as a very young person, but I feel like everyone's life was kind of high key in that way. So I'm sure Mary Queen of Scots could understand and maybe help her out with it. So in 1554, so while they were all in France, like this is proof that they did get to hang out sometimes. So there was a masque performed in France. Mary Fleming had a major role in it, I think maybe because of her noble roots and maybe because of her beauty. So when they returned to Scotland, do you remember there's a thing? So one of the people who came back with her from France to Scotland was this poet called Pierre Chastelard, who was like kind of Mary Queen of Scots' stalker, and he like hid in her bedroom and stuff. So after that, Mary Queen of Scots was obviously freaked out and panicked and scared. And so she had Mary Fleming was the one who she called for and who would join her and like be her roommate and stay in the room with her to make her feel better. So that also speaks to her seeing Mary Fleming as kind of her closest friend, her bestie of all the besties. And May 26, 1562, the four Marys attended the Queen at the ceremony of the opening of the Parliament of Scotland. Randy Randolph watched them. He described the processions, quote, 4 virgins, maids, Marys, demoiselles of honor, or the Queen's mignons. Call them as please your honor, but a fairer sight was never seen. Like, every man at royal court was 40 years old and just like horny for these Marys is what was happening. And the Marys were super hot, and that's what was going on. So during the 12th Day of Christmas pageant in January 1564, Mary Fleming played the part of the Queen of the Bean. And we talked about this, I think, before, and there was a memorable episode of Reign where there was a Queen of the Bean. That's where there's the cake, and whoever gets the slice of cake with the bean in it gets treated as queen for the day. Mary Fleming, in this instance, got that, and so she got. Let's see, Randy Randolph wrote about her at this. Mary Fleming was the great beauty of the Marys. She had royal blood where the others had not, and was the most beautiful as well. Not Randy, but another person who saw her wrote about her as the flower of the flock. So here's Randy explaining her outfit. The Queen of the Bean was that day in a gown of cloth of silver, her head, her neck, her shoulders, the rest of her body so beset with stones that more in our whole jewel house were not to be found. So I picture her in some sort of like diamond encrusted catsuit, like in Britney Spears' Toxic music video. I'm sure it's not that, but it would be that effect, but non-see-through dress form. Randy continues, the Queen herself that day, apparelled in colors white and black, no neither jewel or gold about her that day, but the ring I brought her from Queen Elizabeth hanging at her breast with the lace of black and white about her neck. So Mary is wearing her trademark black and white. Mary Fleming is like a disco ball, practically, and also extremely beautiful. So William Kirkcaldy of Grange, who's a guy who just like comes up here and there in this whole saga, but not enough that I gave him a nickname, but enough that like his name is memorable. So he, September 1564, was the one who wrote that the royal secretary, William Maitland, aka Scottish Machiavelli, from numerous episodes of the Mary Queen of Scots series, was showing an interest in Mary Fleming. And William Kirkcaldy wrote, I doubt not, but you understand me by now that our secretary's wife is near dead, and he is a suitor to Mrs. Fleming, who is as fit for him as I am to be Pope, because she was gorgeous and he was old. Scottish Machiavelli was smitten. He told his friend, William Cecil, that just being around Mary Fleming brought him at least one merry hour in the day. Their age difference, for the record. He was 36 and she was 22. So he is, slightly younger than the 40-year-old men, but just slightly. Anyway, Randy said, wise as he is, he will show himself a fool the way he carried on with his crush on Mary Fleming. So clearly she was like so cool, so hot. Scottish Machiavelli is just this like big old nerd comparatively, but she was into it. And Mary Queen of Scots was like, I could use this match. Like, okay, I'll allow it. So when it became clear, like these two were going to get married. So this was like a 3-year courtship, which was the talk of the English and Scottish courts because Scottish Machiavelli was such an important person. Mary Fleming was so close to the Queen and she had royal blood as well. Randy was cranky, clearly jealous. He wrote that Scottish Machiavelli had been pushed out of the center of political affairs in order to have the time to make love to his coy mistress, Mary Fleming. So this was during the Rizzio era when Scottish Machiavelli was in fact pushed aside so the Queen could have an actually helpful person as her secretary who wasn't actively trying to betray her. So Mary Fleming did wind up marrying Scottish Machiavelli in a ceremony at Stirling Castle on January 6, 1566. They did not have a honeymoon because he had to leave town right away to go to that conference where he, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, Bothwell, and 75 men named James all signed paperwork being like, let's work together to murder Darnley. Great, thanks. We're all going to do this. Here's the paperwork saying we're going to do this. So it's quite a fraught time. And this is where it gets really interesting, actually, because Mary Fleming, Mary Queen of Scots' closest friend, her cousin, marries this guy who is Scottish Machiavelli. He's like sometimes on Mary's side, often not on Mary's side. Like, where does this leave Mary Fleming in this scenario? And where it leaves her might surprise you. This is where I do want to mention On Rain. There's a plotline where Lola, the character who's inspired by Mary Fleming, gets involved with a guy named Narcisse, who is amazing on Rain. He's such a camp, amazing character. He's so villainous. Like, it's a great character. And unexpectedly, he and Lola Fleming on Rain, they kind of hit it off. And they're both just kind of like scheming and sexy. She just takes a lot of sexy baths. And he like keeps walking in on her, being like, no, we can't be together. And she's like, we should be together. He's like, no, we can't. And that's kind of what the vibe is, honestly, between Mary Fleming and Scottish Machiavelli here. So I was messaging with my friend and Tits Up Brigade member, Isabel, who was as into Rain as I was. We both wrote these recaps for it for a fashion website at the time. And Isabel mentioned she wants recognition always for young women who weren't taken advantage of by old men, but gamed them back and became a sneaky AF couple. And that's the vibe of Mary Fleming and Scottish Machiavelli. It's not just like, oh no, like Scottish Machiavelli is taking advantage of this poor woman, like this poor naive woman. Like, Mary Fleming had been through shit by the time she was 5 years old. Like, her mother had an affair with a French king. Like, she has her illegitimate half-brother is like a nobleman in France. Like, she's on top of things. Like, she is also scheming. She's also like at his level, I would say. And that's what we're going to see as the relationship progresses. Like, he's not, okay, we'll just go through kind of what all the steps are here in their interesting and intriguing relationship, in which I would argue she's almost a Lady Macbeth type figure, like just subtly manipulating him to the point where eventually he's just doing whatever she says. Although I'm sure he thinks he's manipulating her, but in fact, she was always in charge. So, like, everything that happened that was shitty, Scottish Machiavelli was on the shitty side of it. He was on the side of, like, Rizzio being murdered. He was on the side of blowing up Darnley's house. He was, like, one of the people who was, like, complicit in convincing Mary to marry Bothwell. He was one of the people who, like, he was never on a good side of anything. Well, he was also married to Mary's best friend. So it's like, what is this situation? What is this relationship? So, but first I do also want to mention Mary Fleming's sister, who is also one of the associated people in the royal court, was Margaret, who is the witch, who I mentioned. She was there when Mary Queen of Scots was giving birth. Margaret Fleming was brought in to transfer the labor pains from Mary Queen of Scots into somebody else, which didn't work, but she was a witch, and I'm not going to talk too much about her right now, because perhaps I will talk about her more in depth closer to Halloween. Wait and see. Anyway, so yeah, Scottish Machiavelli, complicit in getting Queen Mary to marry Bothwell. Mary Fleming might have helped in that instance to try and persuade her as well. Like, Mary Fleming, loyal to Mary Queen of Scots, I think, like, undoubtedly. Her whole life was dedicated to serving Mary Queen of Scots. So it might have been she felt like this is maybe the best option for her at the time. So it's not just like, haha, let's trick her. Like, Scottish Machiavelli was like, haha, let's trick her into marrying Bothwell because then Scottish Machiavelli, can get more power. And he always wanted to, like, ally with England, I think. So Mary Fleming was certainly aware of these schemes and was maybe helping with these schemes. Like, when Mary Queen of Scots was taken captive at that castle, Mary Fleming was the only one of the Marys who waited on her there at Dunbar while Mary Queen of Scots was being held prison by Bothwell. So that's where she was like, Mary Fleming she's in on the scheme. I don't want to be like, she wasn't in on this. She was, but it's kind of like no one knew how this was going to shake out, really. But ultimately, by the time Mary Queen of Scots was in prison, taken by the Confederate asshole lords, Mary Fleming's influence seems clear because Scottish Machiavelli fully switched sides. He was remorseful for what he had done. He showed remorse for his actions, and he set the rest of his life to being on team Mary Queen of Scots. Like, Mary Fleming manipulated him right back. Like, this is where I feel like she wasn't just some sort of little naive younger woman. 22 to 36 is a substantial age gap. In the pantheon of vulgar history, it's not that much. But also Mary Fleming clearly had a real good head on her shoulders here. So she had a son. Well, her first child was a son named James, after, I think, Mary Queen of Scots' son, James. And this baby was born around the same time Mary was being imprisoned and the casket letters scenario was happening. So there's all these rumors. Like, I'm not going to get into the casket letters of it all. Just, like, know that there were these letters, and they were clearly not written by Mary Queen of Scots, but the asshole lord said that they were. So who wrote these? The handwriting apparently looked like hers, but all the Marys had the same handwriting tutor. So there's some people who think like, was Mary Fleming one of the people who helped write these forged letters because she was married to Scottish Machiavelli? But they were all on Mary's side. And frankly, Scottish Machiavelli later did admit when he was a secretary, he had sometimes forged the Queen's handwriting. So like he also could, Mary Queen of Scots said herself, like, my handwriting is really basic. Lots of people could copy it. And never mind, like, Walsingham is on the scene. Anyway, so Mary Queen of Scots is in Loch Leven in prison. March 1568, Scottish Machiavelli sent her a ring that was apparently a gift from Mary Fleming. So it was enameled with a lion and a mouse from Aesop's fable. So there's so much animal imagery in all of these episodes. And I know I mentioned this before, but I'll just remind you now that we know more about who Mary Fleming is. So the imagery in this might have meant, like, the mouse represents Scottish Machiavelli, who is gnawing away at a net surrounding the lion who represents Mary Queen of Scots. So seemingly this ring symbolism was showing the Scottish Machiavelli is trying to help, which he was. So Mary Fleming seems like was really placing him under pressure to help with Mary Queen of Scots' release. And he was doing it. Like, she knew that this was what needed to happen, and he was on board with what she was suggesting. So it's all really schemy and complicated. Like, I'm not trying to say like Mary Fleming was this like perfect sainted person. Like, I think she was a scheming badass, simultaneous to being loyal to Mary. And she was working really hard. Like, and she has this really influential family. So like with her family's backing, like the Flemings, that's a lot of people who would be there to support, to go to war, basically. But then Scottish Machiavelli is also politically motivated to try and provide the evidence to discredit her in the form of the casket letters. When Mary Queen of Scots was in England, Scottish Machiavelli was one of the people who was trying to help her marriage to T-Dog, that potential treason marriage that she was going to do. While simultaneously, he was like a spokesman for her restoration as queen in Scotland. He had the support of the Flemings, also the Gordons, that's the Cock o' the North family, the Hamiltons, aka the Babysitters Club. He was also supporting T-Dog against William Cecil. Like, he's playing all the angles and all the sides. On October 11th, he was able to send Mary Fleming to Mary Queen of Scots with a transcript of one of the casket letters. And that was the whole thing. Mary Queen of Scots just wanted to read the casket letters, and no one would let her read them. Mary Fleming also brought along a note where Scottish Machiavelli was offering his assistance to combat this evidence, which he had maybe produced. Mary Queen of Scots was sensibly like, thanks, but no thanks. Like, your husband sucks, but I love you, Mary Fleming. Like, nice to see you. Okay, so Mary Queen of Scots, she's in England for 19 years, during which time Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart was regent, and then he was assassinated. Eventually, Jeremy Jam from Parks and Recreation took over to become the new regent. Everybody hated him. Scottish Machiavelli hated him. They were huge enemies of each other. Scottish Machiavelli, though, had been ill for quite a while. He had some sort of creeping paralysis, like his legs, like just slowly, more and more of him was becoming paralyzed. I don't know what disease or condition that is. Randy Randolph is still like messy drama queen, living for drama. Like, thank God, writing us all these letters about what was going on. By 1570, he wrote that Scottish Machiavelli's legs were clean gone, like he couldn't use them. His body was so weak he could not walk. Even to sneeze caused extreme pain. Randy was still not over him stealing Mary Fleming, allegedly, from him. So he wrote, "To this hath blessed joy of a young wife brought him." So he's just being like, fuck you stole my girlfriend, I hate you. Anyway. But yeah, so they're firmly on team, let's reinstate Mary as the queen. So Scottish Machiavelli and Mary Fleming were both in Edinburgh Castle in 1573, when it was held by supporters of Mary Queen of Scots against an English army supporting the government of James. Well, I mean, baby BJ, basically. So they were both captured when the castle was surrounded. She was surrendered to, at this point, the regent, Jeremy Jam, still the regent. She was kept a prisoner in Robert Gourlay's house. At this time, Scottish Machiavelli was carried out of the castle on a litter because he was unable to stand or walk, and eventually he died a month later in June. He had been found dead in his bed where he was being kept under house arrest, and it was assumed he took poison to kill himself in, quote, the Roman fashion. So that Cleopatra, Mark Antony vibes, like he would rather die by his own hand than be executed. So he was age 45, and he was left unburied, which was the usual thing for traitors, which he technically was. It was described, I think, in the Antonia Fraser book. his body became a feasting ground for maggots. So do you remember in the earlier episode, the whole thing with the Cock O' the North scenario, where he died and then they like took his body and then like propped his body up in Parliament and like put his like dead corpse on trial? Like, I think they were gearing up for that sort of thing. So Mary Fleming wrote a moving personal plea to William Cecil, who had been friends with Scottish Machiavelli. She said her body of her husband, quote, "which when alive has not been spared in her highness service, may now after his death receive no shame or ignominy." And so William Cecil was like, this is a well-written letter. Handwriting looks suspiciously like Mary Queen of Scots, but whatever. So he got Queen Elizabeth to read it, and Queen Elizabeth was like, fuck this Scottish thing about like putting bodies on trial. Like, this is not cool. Please bury this man. And so they did. Again, the jewels of it all. So twice, I think that same year, 1573, yeah, Mary Fleming was ordered to return some jewelry of rubies and diamonds, which had belonged to Mary Queen of Scots. I don't know if she did, but just like these assholes are just trying to get on all these jewels that people took that Mary gave to people legitimately. Anyway, eventually Scottish Machiavelli's estates and properties were restored by grant of King James, baby BJ, and then she and her son were granted a restoration or rehabilitation, so they were no longer seen as traitors, the wife or son of a traitor, and she was allowed the benefit of a property that Scottish Machiavelli had given her, Bolton in East Lothian. So her son James, we're going to hear about in a bit, just something else he did. He later became a Catholic and lived in France and Belgium in self-imposed exile, and she had a daughter who she named Margaret. In 1581, Mary Queen of Scots asked Elizabeth for permission for Mary Fleming to come and visit her, but there's no evidence that Mary Fleming went, so maybe she didn't get permission. She did marry again, someone called George Meldrum of Fyvie, and she died aged around 39, 1581, about 4 years after the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back, which leads us to our next Mary, Mary Beaton. So she was described as the bravest and most intelligent of the group. So she's kind of the smart, bookish one. So on Reign, she inspired the character of Greer. And if she was in Pride and Prejudice, she would be Lizzie Bennet. If she was in Little Women, she'd be Jo. On Golden Girls, she'd be Dorothy. In The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, she would be Carmen. And I would say in terms of Blackpink, she would be Rosé, because Rosé is... I don't know enough about Blackpink to say if Rosé is like really bookish, but I do know that she's really committed to music and artistry in that way. And so she's very thoughtful, and that's where I would put her if we're describing everybody in terms of Blackpink. Anyway, Mary Beaton. So born 1541. She was a child of Robert Beaton, the fourth Laird of Craich. That's my attempt at Scots pronunciation. Scots people come at me. It really feels like I'm saying a Klingon word, but the fourth Laird of Craich. Her mother was Joanna or Jane Renwall. So her mother had been one of Marie de Guise's ladies in waiting. Her aunt, Mary Beaton's aunt, Janet Beaton, was a mistress of James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Yes, that Bothwell. Everyone's connected in this situation. So she was called by Mary Queen of Scots the Duenna, which I think is a term that just indicates that she's the eldest of the four Marys. So she's kind of like Mary in charge. So in that way, she's like Jisoo from Blackpink, but I'm still going to say she's the Rosé. She's like the leader. She's the leader. You know, K-pop bands have a leader. If she was in BTS, she'd be the RM. So her grandfather, Sir John Beaton, if you're thinking like I've heard the name Beaton before, I'm going to explain to you why. So her grandfather, Sir John Beaton, was the hereditary keeper of the Royal Palace of Falkland. The Beatons of Craich were a younger branch of that same family. So the senior line of Beatons had been given to Scotland Cardinal David Beaton, who is the dirtbag guy who murdered John Knox's mentor, and then he was murdered and like hung up in a castle by like John Knox and some other people. David Beaton, I called him because of how they say the name Harry Beaton in Brigadoon. Anyway, the Beatons, big deal in old time Scotland, perhaps still a big deal in modern time Scotland, who's to say? Also, one of Mary Queen of Scots' faithful ambassadors was Archbishop James Beaton. So just Beatons, like prestigious name. So again, at the age of 5, Mary Beaton was chosen by Marie de Guise as one of the 4 Marys to go to France with the little kindergarten-aged queen. So Mary Fleming was like the prettiest of all of them. Mary Beaton was apparently the most classically beautiful of the 4. So if we're saying like, I don't know if that means, you know, Mary Fleming was more kind of like catalog and Mary Beaton was more kind of like editorial in terms of America's Next Top Model. But where she specifies herself from the others is that she was less flamboyant as Mary Fleming or Mary Livingston. She was bolder than Mary Seton, who we haven't talked about, but who was quite shy and quiet. She was again described as the bravest and most intelligent of the quartet. She also loved books. She loved reading. Apparently, she was tall, plump, and pretty with light hair and dark eyes. She was intelligent and well-read, speaking fluent French and also understanding Italian. She loved poetry. She signed one of her letters Marie de Bethune. So, like, if your name is Mary Beaton, but you're growing up in France and your mother is French, like, I could see that you put your name in a French way, especially where people are word spellings, or you can change your mind all the time in this era. So Mary Beaton, aka Marie de Bethune. Her younger sister, Lucrece Beaton, also joined Mary's household as one of the, not ladies in waiting, but the like maids of honor. So again, like another sister who's on the scene. Mary Beaton attracted the attentions of an older man, quelle surprise. But which older man it is might surprise you. It was in fact Randy Randolph, who I guess had pivoted from one Mary to another, who was still single. So at the time of this courtship, 1564, Randy was 45 and Mary was 21. So again, Randy was Queen Elizabeth's ambassador to the Scottish court. He was like, hey, Mary Beaton, like, can you be my wife/mistress? And also, can you spy on Mary Queen of Scots for me, for Queen Elizabeth? And Mary Beaton was like, fuck you, of course not. What do you know? Like, fuck off, Randy. Although they were like known to be sort of courting or like hanging out with each other informally. In April 1565, Mary Beaton and Randy were a team. They played some sort of game called Bowls with Mary Queen of Scots and Lord Darnley, which is just like a cursed double date. Honestly, Mary Beaton and Randy, Mary Queen of Scots and Darnley playing, I don't know, cards or bowling or whatever. Anyway, Mary Beaton and Randy won. Darnley gave Mary Beaton a ring and a brooch with 2 agates worth 50 crowns. One of Randy's Scottish friends, Alexander Clark, sent him a letter teasing him about, I love that these like 40-year-old men are all throwing themselves at the Marys and all the other 40-year-old men are making fun of them for it. Like, it's good to have a friend to keep you in check like that. But it also puts it in perspective that like some of these do end up in marriages, but also people are just like, you're a fool, she's young, like you're a goofball. So Alexander Clark wrote this letter saying, quote, and as to your mistress Mary Beaton, she is both, this is like he was making up fake words where it's like words are hard enough to read in oldie time letters, but he's making up words. Alexander Clark wrote, and as to your mistress Mary Beaton, she's both derimpus and sclerenbruendit, and you in like manner without contrabaction or clyperant. So you're both worth little money. Honestly, these guys are just nerds. I don't know. George Buchanan, who you may remember, I'm just like, oh, him, when these names pop up. He was the guy who was friends with Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart in France. And then he came over to be Mary Queen of Scots' like Latin tutor. And he also wrote some of the Mask plays. Then later, after Mary was arrested, George Buchanan is the one who wrote the erotic fan fiction about her. But before all that, George Buchanan was just like the courtly writer. And he wrote Latin verses praising Mary Beaton and her performance in one of his masks, where I guess she played a queen. He wrote, the fair Fleming was surely chosen by fortune to be a queen, and not for Twelfth Night only. He compared her to Venus in beauty and to Minerva in wit. So, like, again, everyone is just horny for the Marys. I like that she's fair Fleming. And then, were they all like this? Like Fair Fleming, Lusty Livingston, like, were those the nicknames just because they couldn't call them all Mary? It was confusing. I don't know. So when it became time for her to get married, like Mary Queen of Scots was just like, I need to marry my Marys in these politically advantageous ways. You know, Randy Randolph, I'm sure, was just there like raising his hand like, ooh, pick me. But he was out of favor because he had been on team Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart recently in one of those like anti-Mary attempted coups. Mary Beaton couldn't be married to Randy because that would get her too close to the enemy, which is also interesting about how Mary Queen of Scots was cool with Mary Fleming marrying Scottish Machiavelli, which is maybe where she trusted Mary Fleming was up to his level, but also she knew that Scottish Machiavelli could be changed. But Randy was just a hot mess. So who did she marry Mary Beaton to? Well, remember we talked all about Jean Gordon. We had a whole episode about her. And so as a teenager, Jean Gordon's true love had been Alexander Ogilvy, but then Mary Queen of Scots made Jean Gordon marry Bothwell instead. And in fact, Mary Queen of Scots also arranged the marriage of Alexander Ogilvy to Mary Beaton. So part of this is Mary Queen of Scots probably knew that Alexander Ogilvy and Jean Gordon were in love with each other, and she just didn't want, like, these political marriages had to sort out in a certain way. And so she felt like, well, okay, if I'm marrying Jean to Bothwell, I need to make sure Alexander's married to someone as well, just so there's not any risk of Jean leaving him or whatever. So anyway, Mary Beaton and Alexander Ogilvy's wedding was 2 months after Jean and Bothwell's, and I do think they were of similar age for once in this episode. So Mary Beaton was with Mary Queen of Scots in Edinburgh Castle when Mary Queen of Scots gave birth to Prince James, and Mary Beaton was the one who, I guess she left the room because it was all women in the room, and then she went to tell a guy who like rode to London to tell the news to Elizabeth, who was just like, oh, goddammit, she had a son, ugh. Anyway, but that just shows how trusted Mary Beaton was. So, you know, Mary Queen of Scots saga is happening. And when we fast forward to the part where Mary escaped Loch Leven, and there were all of the Scottish guys waiting across the loch to like fight for her. So Mary Beaton's husband, Alexander Ogilvy, was among those facing off against Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart. Eventually, they lost this battle. Alexander was captured alongside like the other Beaton family members who had been involved. They were sent to Edinburgh Castle, sentenced to execution until John Knox called for pardons of everybody, and Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart agreed. So like for once in their life, they did something okay. I think it's because they were just like, we can't kill every Scottish man in Scotland. There'll be nobody left. So Alexander Ogilvy paid a fine and was able to return home. So Mary Beaton was still on Mary Queen of Scots' payroll even after the Queen was sent to England, because technically she's still lady in waiting. So she was getting a bit of income. She and Alexander Ogilvy were growing their wealth. They're living in the north of Scotland, and in a kind of Bess of Hardwicke vibes, Alexander Ogilvy had embarked on an ambitious building project, building Boyne Castle. So it's one of the castles that today is in, it was abandoned and now it's just kind of like ruins, but it shows the outlines of a grand house. So there were rumors, like the casket letters of it all. People were like, of all the Marys, Mary Beaton's handwriting was the most similar to Mary's. But it's just like, why would she have done that? She was in North Scotland, like learning languages, building a library and a house. Like she wasn't doing that. Anyway, but apparently her handwriting was the most similar to Mary Queen of Scots'. And then as things progressed, like they were still on team, like Catholic, we support Mary, even as like the Protestants took over, and that was clearly not the way the winds were blowing. So this kind of led to some financial difficulties because this wasn't a popular kind of way to be, and they needed money for this building project. And I love this detail because guess who Mary Beaton turned to try and appeal to for money? She turned to her old pal Randy, asking him to please intercede for her with Jeremy Jam from Parks and Recreation, who's currently the regent. And Randy, to his credit, passed along this request. By this point, I was reading up a bit about Randy, and he married Frances Walsingham's sister. So, and then he went to Russia. He had an interesting life. I might do a So This Asshole on him one day because he is an intriguing figure. Anyway, Randy passed along this request to Jeremy Jam, and somehow this all kind of worked out. They managed to reach an agreement so that Alex Ogilvy didn't lose this land. So it seems like these guys really did help out, and I do, first of all, appreciate the audaciousness and the bravery to turn to your like former almost boyfriend decades after you had not married him and asking him for money. But the fact that Randy did is kind of cool of him. Anyway, May 1590. So Mary Beaton was one of the people who greeted the new Queen of Scotland, Anne of Denmark, when she arrived to marry baby BJ, who was now an adult man. She was among 30 other gentlewomen. So Mary Queen of Scots had written various wills. One of them, she had said to leave her books in French, English, and Italian to Mary Beaton, which also shows how Mary Beaton was kind of like the bookish, clever one. This will was not used. As we know, they just kind of ransacked Mary's shit and didn't give stuff that she wanted to give to the people she wanted to give it to. But Mary Beaton was like lifelong bookworm. She became a friend of the poet William Fowler, who served as secretary to Anne of Denmark. He dedicated a translation to the Right Honourable Lady Mary Beaton, Lady Boyne. She wrote a poem to preface his translation of the Triumphs of Petrarch, and she and Alex had built up a library in their castle in a time when books were scarce. So she was like a really committed book person in a time when it was hard to get books. She died 1597 at the age of 55. She and Alex Ogilvy had 3 sons. James, it's like all the Marys all had sons all called James. So they're like the Jameses. But again, that's like the only name there was. James, Andrew, and Robert were their sons. Alexander Ogilvy later married his first love, Jean Gordon. And when he died, he was buried next to Mary Beaton because, and I think we talked about that in the Jean Gordon episode, or at least it's in the book about Jean Gordon, Daughters of the North. Like Jean Gordon was cool with that. Like Alexander Ogilvy, like that was his family. Like they got to spend their like Golden Girls era together, but he was married to Mary Beaton for a long time. There are conflicting reports about where Mary Beaton was buried. One suggestion is maybe in a place called Boyndy Church, which leads us to Mary number 4, Mary Seton, who I feel like we all know a bit more about just because she was the one who was present with Mary for most of her life, and that's because she never got married. So in terms of reign, it's interesting because reign is doing its own thing. You know, it's basically alternative history. The first few episodes, there are 4 ladies in waiting for reasons I will not disclose. There become less ladies in waiting as the show goes on. Anyway, so the person on reign who is the most similar to Mary Seton is Ailey, who in the early episodes of season 1 of Reign is one of the ladies in waiting. And she's very sweet and naive and kind of innocent and like kind of pure little cinnamon roll type. And that's the Mary Seton vibe, which is why in Little Women, she's Beth. It's a bit trickier to get into the other ones because like she's not really Sophia in Golden Girls, but that's the only one who's left. And she's not really Mary Bennett in Pride and Prejudice, but that's the only one who's left. Like, she is like Mary Bennett in the sense of like she's a spinster. If we're getting into Blackpink, though, I do think the comparing her to Jennie is accurate because Jennie is also very sweet and quiet and kind of shy, and Mary Seton also was. Who's left in Sister of the Traveling Pants? Like Tibby, like that's not the vibe. I don't know. I didn't do Sex and the City people, but none of them are Mary Seton. I guess Miranda. Anyway, no, not really. Anyway, Mary Seton is Jennie from Blackpink / Beth from Little Women is who she is. She's sweet and just pure and kind and nice. So Mary Seton came from one of the grandest Scottish families. She was the daughter of George, the 6th Lord Seton, by his second marriage to a French woman, Marie Pierce, who had come to Scotland as one of Marie de Guise's maids of honor. So 2 of the 4 Marys had mothers who were French women. So there's that French connection as well. The French Pierce family claimed to have descended from the Percy family of Northumberland. So when Queen Mary returned to Scotland after her ceremonial entry in Edinburgh, she went to Linlithgow Palace, where the 4 Marys went to the house of Mary Seton's brother George Seton at Seton Palace for dinner. So Mary Seton was the quietest of the Marys, although having talked about the other 3, it's like not hard to be the quietest of the Marys. Like the other 3 all sound pretty talkative. She was also the most pious and the most devoted to serving her queen versus to the pleasures of the court. We know that she had a huge talent for fashion and hairstyling. So she learned that art in France. And I think not just like anyone could learn an art, but Mary Seton was so good at it. Like there's clearly some innate talent as well. So we know that Mary Queen of Scots wore false hair pieces. Like when she was a younger person with like a full head of natural hair, she still added hair pieces to that because that was the look. And we know this because there are repeated references to these hair pieces in various inventories of her belongings, as well as lists of bags to carry them in. When she was sent to Loch Leven, her hair pieces were among the first things she sent for when she was trapped there. Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it was in the Antonia Fraser book, which is a bit older. So, like people just talk about hair is treated differently now than maybe it was before. Like people nowadays are very open about using a weave or like hair pieces or wigs. Like I think people used to not talk about that as much, although people have used these since forever. So in the Antonia Fraser book, she says at one point where it's like, Mary Queen of Scots still used these like wigs and hair pieces, even when she had like beautiful, long, natural hair. And it's like, yeah, because the look she was going for, you needed a wig or a hair piece. Like she was going for these were the looks she wanted. Anyone can wear wigs for any reasons. Anyway, and Mary Queen of Scots, that brought her confidence, and that was the look that she was after. And then later in her life, like when Mary Queen of Scots left Scotland, she cut off all her hair. So Mary Seton, the wigs of it all were like quite crucial because having a pixie cut was not a thing women did in that era when you were a queen. And then later, Mary was so ill, her hair got thin and stuff. So again, you've got Mary Seton there on the scene, just like making sure that her hair always looked amazing. Speaking of when they were in Loch Leven, twice Mary Seton, like she was called for. Mary Queen of Scots was like, please, can I have like one of my Marys with me? They're like, okay, you can have this one. And thank God, because she was there for her, like in terms of being devoted to her mistress, like serving, like devoting her life to serving Mary Queen of Scots. Like whatever's needed, like whether it's hairstyling, whether it's swapping clothes, standing in the window, pretending to be her, which she did twice. At one point, Mary Seton was the one who did a trial run of climbing over the walls to test if Mary could do it. And then she hurt herself. And then the guards were like, oh, let's keep Mary Queen of Scots away from the walls, maybe. Anyway, but Mary Seton, the second disguise switcheroo was successful, so she was crucial part of Mary Queen of Scots being able to escape with the help of young Willie, etc. So Mary Seton's role and talent as the Queen's hairdresser was described in detail by Sir Francis Knowles, the father of Lettice Knowles, who was Mary's first kind of babysitter when she went to England. So he wrote a letter to William Cecil because Mary Queen of Scots, like wherever she went, like she just like cut off all her hair and then like emergency went to England and she's like, please send me my wigs. I need my wigs. And then when she was arrested and sent to Loch Leven, she's like, first order of business, send me my wigs. So anyway, Mary had told Francis Knowles that Mary Seton was the finest busker of a woman's head and hair in any country. I think it's true. Francis Knowles wrote, yesterday and this day she did set such a curled hair upon the queen that was said to be a periwig that showed very delicately, and every other day lightly she hath a new device of hairdressing without any cost, and yet set forth a woman gaily well. He was the one who was like, what color and texture is Mary Queen of Scots' hair? I can't even tell because these wigs are so good. Presumably, I have to think Mary Seton being there was help for Mary Queen of Scots in this really traumatic time, reminding her of happier times, just having her bestie there with her, especially her bestie who knows that like looking good is so important for Mary Queen of Scots' mental health and just self-care. Mary Seton was there as Mary Queen of Scots was sitting around, in the Swamp Castle and other places with Bess of Hardwick doing embroideries. Like Mary Seton was there. So when we see some of the embroideries that were done in that era, Mary Seton probably contributed to some of them. I have to presume if her embroidery was as skillful as her hairstyling, she was helpful and that these were beautiful stitches that she did. Mary Seton did fall ill. In August 1570, her mother, Mary Pierce, heard that Mary Seton was ill and wrote to Mary Queen of Scots asking, could Mary Seton come home? And we talked about this a bit in the Mary Queen of Scots Trapped episodes. Anyway, but this was at a period of time where Mary Queen of Scots was not allowed to receive or send any letters. So even though this is a letter from Mary Seton's mom being like, can my sick daughter come visit me, please? The messenger carrying the letters, John Moon, was captured, and Mary Pierce, Mary Seton's mom, was imprisoned in Edinburgh just for writing a letter to the exiled queen. This was August, so that October, so 2 months later, Queen Elizabeth heard that Mary Pierce had been arrested and would be banished from Scotland for writing to her daughter. And Queen Elizabeth was like, fuck this, this is dumb. And so she wrote to Regent Lennox, who, again, that was Darnley's dad, was the regent, and she said, Elizabeth is like, this is no great cause. Basically, no big deal. Although Mary Pierce had, by the time Elizabeth intervened, she had already been released, and she promised not to write to Mary Queen of Scots again. So Mary Queen of Scots kept being moved around. Mary Seton was able to stay with her. And there was a plan at one point for Mary Seton to visit her family. I think she's been sick for at this point, at least 10 years and has just been with Mary, just being her ride or die with her all the time. There was a point where they thought that maybe it could switch. Somebody else would come and be the new bestie for Mary, but then that other person got married. And so Mary Seton kept her job. Mary Seton there was one admirer, I didn't write down his name here, who wanted to marry her, but then he was involved in the Northern Rising, which is when the Bible burning thing that T-Dog was involved with, and then he was executed, so she couldn't marry him. Mary Queen of Scots got a new master of the household, whose name was Andrew Beaton, presumably part of the massive Beaton clan, who fell for Mary Seton, and he wanted to marry her. There's two things standing in their way. Firstly, even though he was from a very fancy, well-regarded family, Mary Seton was from the Setons, and was he good enough for her? But the other thing sounds like when Mary Seton had been in France, she had made a vow of celibacy, which was a piece of paperwork that had to be renounced or whatever. It had to be annulled. So Andrew Beaton was like, well, I don't know about the family thing, but so he went to Paris to obtain a dispensation to marry a person who had made a vow of celibacy, which I guess he did. But then on the journey back from France to Scotland or to England, he drowned. The boat sank, I guess. So, that sucks. And yeah, so Mary Seton, 2 years later, she never married anybody. She was permitted to leave Mary. She's permitted to go back to France and to retire. So starting in 1583, she lived at the convent of St. Pierre at Reims, where the abbess was Renee de Guise, Mary Queen of Scots' mother, the sister of Marie de Guise. Mary Seton, though, her devotion to Mary Queen of Scots was not diminished. None of them were. The Marys were they made this vow to be her friends when they were 5 years old, and none of them ever wavered, ever. So the same year she sent away, Mary Seton sent a gift to Mary Queen of Scots via the French ambassador. She sent a book and a box, and we just know that both of these things were searched for secret messages because everything was being searched for secret messages. Although I don't think Mary Seton is a secret message type of person, but we do know that she sent her some presents. So she didn't go to France and forget about her. It still mattered to her. In 1586, Mary Seton wrote a letter to the new French ambassador who was headed to Scotland, from France, to go be the new ambassador in Scotland. And she wrote about how much she missed Scotland. She wrote, "It is now nearly 20 years since I left Scotland, and in that time it has pleased God to take the best part of my relations, friends, and acquaintances. Nevertheless, I presume there remain still some who knew me, and I shall be obliged by your remembering me to them, as occasion may serve." So it's interesting because Mary always missed France. That was the place and time where she was happiest. And Mary Seton felt like Scotland was the time where she was maybe happiest. Mary Seton wrote a letter in 1608 to Bess of Hardwick's daughter, Mary, who was then the Countess of Shrewsbury, which I guess because she had hung out with Bess and Mr. Bess and their whole family for 19 years, or give or take. And so she was still in communication with them. So in this letter, Mary Seton mentioned her right arm was paralyzed. And she wrote the letter in French because she had forgotten the little English that she knew after 20 years, as she calls herself a poor recluse in a monastery. She also sent other letters to Arbella Stewart, other letters to Mary, Bess's daughter. She wrote to a companion of Anne of Denmark in 1614, and then Mary Seton died at the convent in Reims in 1615. So little is known about her last years at this convent other than what was written by James, the son of Mary Fleming and Scottish Machiavelli, who went to visit her at some point because maybe I don't know, I feel like the Marys were all like cool aunties to each other's sons, all called James. So this guy, James, Scottish Machiavelli Jr., visited the convent to see his auntie Mary Seton, and he found her to be living in poverty and suffering from failing health. He complained to her family, to whom he was vaguely related, and also to King James, but there's no evidence of a response. The bequests in her will, like when she died, showed that she was wealthy, so I don't know if he misinterpreted what he saw or if he was exaggerating things. Anyway, Mary Seton outlived Mary Queen of Scots by nearly 30 years. So let me just do some quick math here that I forgot to do. So she would have been like age 75 or so when she died. She lasted 30 years longer. So maybe that's where she's the Sophia and the Golden Girls, because she's the oldest one. Anyway, those are the Marys. And I will say when I started researching them, I couldn't even remember what the 4 different last names were, let alone who was who. But by the end of it, I was just like, oh, that's that one. Oh, that's that one. And now, like, will I remember, 6 months from now, which is which? I don't know. But I like to think I will. So we're going to score them as a group. This is a similar thing to what I did with when we did the Mazarinets, Hortense Mancini's sisters. Like, we're just going to score them as a group. Although there are other categories. Like, I don't know. Like, there's the Lady Jane Seymour Memorial Award for Outstanding Supporting Performance, which we have given to Mary Seton for her devotion to Mary Queen of Scots. I don't see myself giving this award to any of the other Marys for their devotion to each other or to Mary. I think Mary Seton was the one who was the most there for her. And it's not that the other ones didn't want to be. It's just they weren't in a position to help as directly as Mary Seton was. The Jeweled Tortoise Award, that's a very rare and prestigious award for people who go above and beyond in the best friending business. So we're going to score on the Fredigan Memorial Scandaliciousness scale. So for the 4 Marys, like, this is a combination. So scandaliciousness, I feel like, like they showed up and they were dancing and like cute and 19 years old, and all these 40-year-old men were either like horny for them or just like really mad about them having boobs or whatever. That's not scandalous. That's just like them existing in a patriarchal hellhole. So I wouldn't necessarily call any of them scandalous. Mary Seton helping Mary Queen of Scots escape is a bit scandalous. Mary Fleming was involved with Scottish Machiavelli, and I imagine that it was like this sexy Lola Narcisse relationship, which is scandalous, but not really. Like, God bless them, the Marys. I'm going to give them ultimately a 4. I'm going to give them a 4 for scandaliciousness, because that wasn't their job. That's not what they're there for. There's nothing wrong with having a low scandaliciousness score. Like, that's just what they were up to. The 4 is mostly for Mary Seton for her complicity in Mary's schemes. Speaking of schemes, scheminess is the next one. So I do think there is evidence of scheminess with Mary Fleming. Like, even though we don't, like, she married Scottish Machiavelli, and he, over the course of their relationship, completely changed from being this like weaselly, playing every sides guy to being ride or die for Mary Queen of Scots, which speaks to her being able to manipulate him in a long-term, very successful way. Mary Seton, her scheminess, like, she didn't come up with the schemes necessarily to switch clothes, but she was involved in the scheminess of trying to climb over the wall, switching clothes twice. Like, I think for scheminess, like, it's not a high score. Like, Livingston, I don't know about any schemes she did. Beaton, that's not really scheminess. That's just like reading books. I'm gonna say 5 for scheminess, just because of the subtextual scheminess of Mary Fleming, and because we know that Mary Seton was involved in like helping Mary Queen of Scots escape from prison, which is inherently scheming, whatever her role was in coming up with the scheme. She helped pull it off. There's significance, and this is one where I was just like not sure. I actually turned to, so people who join my Patreon at least $5 or more a month get access to a Discord, which is basically just a big group chat where we're just like talking shit about John Knox all the time. But also, I go there for when I have questions and I was like, y'all, I'm doing this episode about the 4 Marys and what is their significance? Like, I love them too much. I can't decide. Like, what is their significance? Like, when you think, okay, when I think about Mary Queen of Scots, like, it's her and there's the four Marys. Like on Reign, it's like there's Mary and there's the Marys. Like in the 2018 Saoirse Ronan movie, it's like there's Mary and there's the Marys. Like her having these like backup dancers / singers is part of her myth and legend, but the Marys themselves, are they significant? Of them, I think Mary Seton is significant in the sense of without her, perhaps Mary Queen of Scots wouldn't have escaped Loch Leven, which was an important part of her story. I think they're significant to Mary for just like having at least one of them with her all the time just kind of helped her out mental health wise. Like Mary was so known for her fashion. Mary Seton was involved in that, but also the 4 of them, like Mary Queen of Scots showing up in the black and the white outfits was emphasized by having the 4 Marys with her. But that's just like, they're not just accessories. It's tricky. I'm going to give them a 4 for significance, 1 for each of them because I like them all a lot. The sexism bonus is where we give points for people who maybe could have accomplished more were it not for sexism. I do want to say, when I was doing the Best of Hardwick episode 2 weeks ago, I gave her, I think, a 4 for sexism. And I know some of you like to play along at home. So I do want to make clear, in very rare cases, people do get less than 5 for sexism. Early on in the show, I would say, everyone gets at least a 5 because the patriarchy is just everywhere and it's shitty. Best of Hardwick, I gave 4 because she made the patriarchy her bitch. Like, how much more could she have accomplished without sexism? Like, how much more could she have accomplished at all? She accomplished everything. Like, sexism didn't really get in her way. Other people who have had lower than 5 on sexism, again, it's just a few people. It's like Empress Sisi got less because she wasn't, I forget what her rationale was exactly, but I don't think that sexism was necessarily what got in her way. Lola Montez also, I think, got less than 5 on sexism because that didn't stop her. Like some women, if I ever do Elizabeth I, I feel like sexism didn't stop her. In fact, it helped her. So, but in terms of sexism, I'm going to give them the general standard score of 5 because all of them, like maybe they could have done more if they hadn't had to find a husband. Not that Mary Seton did get married, but like, I don't know. I think that the fact that they went to Scotland and all of these like 40-year-old men were just drooling over them or like calling them whores all the time sucks, and they could have had much more fun if that wasn't happening to them. So altogether, this is a score of 18, which in terms of this podcast is pretty low because I tend to talk about really scandalous people. In fact, that is the second lowest score anyone has ever gotten ever. But that's where they land because I talk a lot about royals and stuff, and they're able to get away with more shit than non-royals, but also we know about them. So the fact we know about the Marys at all is impressive because it's kind of like the season we did, the Jean Gordon episode or even the Elizabeth of Valois episode, just people who are living more kind of like standard issue life for this era. I like to look at them too, partially because it shows how people like Mary Queen of Scots are set apart, how they're living their lives differently. Or Bess of Hardwick is maybe a better example of somebody who could have lived a life like that, but she just through her tenacity and good luck and things, like she was able to make a different sort of life for herself. So it's interesting to look at people like the Marys. And also I like this as kind of the finale for the Mary Queen of Scots season because there's been high drama. And this is just kind of like, well, here's some nice people who are nice. It's sort of a nice way to sort of chill out. Speaking of the Mary Queen of Scots season and this being the last episode of it, I do have information that I'm in the early stages of planning a live YouTube stream. So sometime in October, I'm going to be doing a YouTube live with Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. We're going to do a live episode of Vulgar Peace Theater, which is where the 3 of us talk about costume dramas. And we're going to talk about the much requested 2018 Mary Queen of Scots film, which is literally called Mary Queen of Scots. It's the one starring Saoirse Ronan as Mary, Margot Robbie as Elizabeth, Taylor Swift's ex, Joe Alwyn, as Bobby Duds, and David Tennant as John Knox. Lots of people in it, lots to talk about. I'm really interested because I watched that movie in the theater in 2018 when it first came out, when I was just kind of like riding on vibes. I'm like, I know the story of Mary Queen of Scots. I have watched Reign, and I watched it and I was like, seems accurate to me. But now that I know so much more than I did then, I think it'll be interesting to watch it, especially now that I will maybe kind of know more who some of the main characters are. Anyway, the date has not been chosen for that yet. When one is, I will announce it here on the podcast so you can all enjoy that. I think that can be like the true finale of the Mary Queen of Scots season. But also, we're done talking about Mary Queen of Scots, but the podcast continues on. So there's going to be still episodes. There's still going to be an episode every week, just so you know. My style in preparing this podcast is when I'm reading about a person, I really like to immerse myself in the story. And that's why these podcast episodes end up being like 2.5 hours long. But I really I want to read a biography. I want to look at more biographies. I want to look at pictures of them to really sit with it until I feel like I know the person. And that's where I feel comfortable sharing the story with you. That takes time and effort and energy. I'm not able to do that every week, which is why some weeks it's going to be not that. So some weeks it will be me sharing a story with you that I've researched. Some weeks it's going to be a guest coming on to share a story with me and with you. And that's sometimes where I'm just like, I really love this story. But instead of me just paraphrasing one person who wrote an academic paper, like I'm going to bring that person on so they can explain it like one-on-one to you. So sometimes it's going to be me talking. Sometimes it's going to be a guest telling a story. Sometimes it'll be an author talking about their book coming up that I think you will enjoy. So every week there's going to be something. And thank you for going with me on this journey. I know this is different from other podcasts, and that's because I'm kind of figuring this out as I go along. Like the first season of this podcast, I did like 6 episodes and then I took like 6 months off and I was like, oh, hey, here's some more episodes. Like I've just been figuring it out. But now that I know, like for a long time, the biggest request I had was like people wanted weekly episodes. And with the international season, I did that, burnt myself out a bit trying to like get like with the amount of research I was doing every week to do a new episode. So what I found is a way to be able to provide you with weekly content while also, you know, having self-care for myself is to have different sorts of things. So every week there's going to be something fun. There's going to be something nice. There's lots of fun stuff coming up. The show is a beautiful potpourri. This is how I figured out to be able to have weekly episodes for you all. And thank you all for understanding that and like vibing with me on this journey. But please note, because I also have some people have been like, when there are going to be like episodes of just Anne, like there are going to be those. It's just not every week. I can't do that every week. But if you are just like, I want some more just Anne talking in my ear holes. Well, if you join the Patreon, which is at patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter, you'll get access to all of the archived episodes that I have there and all the new ones that are coming. So I've done a bunch of episodes called So This Asshole where I talk about gross men from history. And honestly, after doing this research on the Marys, like 100%, I'm going to be doing one on Randy Randolph coming up at some point. Because just the Walsingham of it all, the Russia of it all, like just this messy bitch, like I feel like that appeals to me to learn more about him. So we've got episodes there talking about how shitty Napoleon is, Charles Dickens, like Thomas Jefferson, Hernan Cortez. I feel like John Smith from like the Pocahontas story. Anyway, so you can hear all those on the Patreon if you subscribe for at least $5 or more a month, and also Vulgar Peace Theater, which are episodes where Allison and Lana and I talk about different costume dramas we've talked about. Most recently, we're going to be doing one on Chevalier, the movie about the Chevalier of St. George, but we've also talked about Cyrano with Peter Dinklage, Newsies, the musical. We did Anastasia, the animated film, A Knight's Tale, like just a real Tombstone. We rotate which of us is choosing the movie. So mostly it's episodes where one of us has seen the movie and the other two hasn't. And we have a really good time doing that. And yeah, so also if you join the Patreon for at least $5 or more a month, you get access to our Discord, which is our little group chat thing. And I'm really happy with how it's shaping up. We've at the moment, by the time you hear this, it'll probably be done. But we've been doing a thing on there that's like Vulgar History Survivor Sim, which is like taking some of the most memorable people from Vulgar History and what would happen if they were on Survivor. But we're also just like chatting and having a nice time and like stuff about the scandaliciousness score or the significance score I was asking people there. So because I do get nice messages from people who are listening, members of the Tits Out Brigade, and sometimes I think it'd be nice for you all to talk to each other, and the Discord is a way that I found to do that. Anyway, so you can also, if you join my Patreon, patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter for at least $1 or more a month, then you also get early access to all the episodes and ad-free access to all the episodes. So every contribution helps. And the more money I make from the Patreon, the more time I'm able to contribute to this podcast, which is part of why I'm able to do weekly episodes now. You can also get in touch with me if you have ideas of people to talk about in future episodes, which I love getting. I've got a really long list, but I am happy to get more suggestions. And like the more kind of, to me, lesser known, obscure people are often always suggestions from you, of people from your culture or your country or your community. I do still want to do an episode, at least one, about every country where there's somebody out there listening right now. So if I haven't talked about someone from your country, let me know who you suggest from there. and you can get in touch with me. There's a form at vulgarhistory.com. Or you can also email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I'm also on social media. I'm most active on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod. I'm also on TikTok at vulgarhistory. I'm on like Threads. I'm on Blue Sky. Like, I don't know how this is going to all shake out with like where people are landing in terms of social media. But if you're on one of those places, like follow me there and say hi, and I'll know that maybe that's where I should be posting more. Like, truly, I don't know. But in terms of pictures and things, like that's going to be mostly on Instagram. I also have merch available. vulgarhistory.com/store takes you to the TeePublic store, which is best for people in the US. Or if you're outside the US, you can shop at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. Both sites, like, every couple weeks have a sale. So if you're like, ooh, I don't know if I want to buy this merch at this price, like at this full price, like truly just wait a week. There's probably going to be a sale. And I think that's everything I have to tell you. I'll tell you one more thing, which is just that I also have a newsletter, which has nothing to do with this podcast at all. Honestly, I started it so that I would have a place to talk about not women's history, because I was starting to see that as a lack in my life. I mostly talk about murder mysteries that I'm reading or watching, and that's at 3nicethings.substack.com. Anyway, so many amazing episodes coming up, weekly episodes. It's all good. I'm not going anywhere. Thank you all for listening to me on this journée. I still laugh a little when I think, or some of you mentioned that I've said this in past episodes, when I ever thought I could have done Mary Queen of Scots in 4 weeks. That was preposterous of me. And anyway, until next time, my friends, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Sheshin Marachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Nowadays, trends and news cycles change faster than we can blink. But there are some things that withstand the test of time. And if you're looking for a connection to something timeless, and maybe also a glimpse of life at a slower pace, I believe everyone can relate to the very human experiences explored in Jane Austen's novels. And that's where I come in. My name is Alison Larkin. I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin. I spent a lot of my childhood in the part of England where Jane Austen lived and wrote, and now that I live in the States, nothing gives me a sense of homecoming quite like narrating her books. On this show, you'll listen to award-winning narration. I'll give myself a pat on the back for that. As well as conversations with actors, writers, and other fascinating people who all share a passionate love for Jane Austen. So please, join me as we embark on a wonderful journey through Jane Austen's work. Be sure to listen and subscribe to the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Subscribe to the Ghost Story Guys now on your favorite podcatcher to hear episodes like High Strangeness in Chicago, The Mystery of Missing Time, and The Haunting of Vietnam, along with dozens of others.
We've talked about mythical bridges, doppelgangers, haunted seaside towns, and so much more.
Remember that story about the guy who was trapped inside a dream and something was hunting him? That was upsetting.
Yes it was.
Want us to help ruin your sleep? Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.